Stagma, everybody. So my boy Chonsa made this glossary of terms regarding formalism. It's still a work in progress, but the section entitled Absolutism has been filled out, so I thought we would go through the glossary. Shout out to Chonsa. The link to the glossary will be in the description, so go check it out, bookmark it, and watch for updates. So the terms are in alphabetical order. The first one is absolutist ontology, and it reads, quote, basic assumption that the individual is posterior to society, prior to desires, freedom, or any concept of individuality is the social center, the former dependent upon it. Consequently, there will be instances where a sovereign's rule cannot be formally bound or substituted by a law, logic, or written constitution, only justified by priests after, quote, he who decides the exception, unquote, has given the discretion, end quote. I re-explained this in my Liberalism 101 video. Chris B. from Reactionary Future and the Journalism of Neo-Absolutism puts forward that there are two types of ontologies. You are either an absolutist or an anarchist. To be the latter is to believe the individual comes before society genealogically, and thus you are unable to justify, even if you would like to, a definitive role for authority. We have spoken before, both in my Myth of Markets video and in Liberalism 101, that liberal or anarchist ontologies must assume many presuppositions about humanity that typically must conjure up ahistorical scenarios of spontaneous orders that don't have a shred of evidence of ever really happening. Adam Smith's Land of Barter, John Locke's State of Nature, these types of things. And essentially they view humanity as spawning in a Minecraft server and having to contract with other players into society, transforming the land into their property and setting up anti-griefing rules. While formalism is more like Age of Mythology, there is never a game without a TC, a social center that produces villages. So Age of Mythology actually happened, and so an absolutist ontology says a humanity without a social center is impossible. We know vis-a-vis Ray Gerard and later psychologists like Michael Tomasello that humanity is incarnated by joint attention. Human desires are subject to and mediated by the desires of others, and it occurs pre-rationally and subconsciously. We have used many examples of this, such as a child holding up a toy only to have other children mimetically copy the desire for the toy, such that conflict even breaks out over it as each child mimics each other's desires for it. And we have used the example of Chad Warden having blonde hair, and then after the PS Triple comes out, he dyes it black.
See, like my hair over here, bitch? My hair? You like that shit? That shit is slick. Shit is black. Shit, my hair was blonde before this shit, alright? I dyed that shit black. You know why? Cause PS Triple. The PS Triple. That shit is money. Money.
Gans takes this joint attention as put forward by Chad Warden to establish anthropologically that there must always be a center that humanity defers to. We are Wardenists in this regard.
Have you played the PS1? Nigga.
But before Chad Warden uploaded his video Why the PS3 is better than the Wii and 360, there is Robert Filmer's Patriarcha that establishes something similar. We've spoken about all this before. So in contrast to this, the entry for liberal ontology reads, quote, liberal ontology, basic assumption that the individual is anterior to society due to the rational individual being imagined as coming into being before society's influence. It leads to a logic where you seek to liberate the individual from society's influence / injunction as much as possible, end quote. So we just talked about a binary of different ontologies, and we're now going to introduce a binary regarding the visibility or acceptance of absolutist ontology. The first of which being Blue Empire, obscured power. Blue Empire gains its power through informational asymmetries and is thus invisible. It is often associated with moneyed power, but can also come from other sources like the intelligence community. Examples include things such as NGOs, grassroots puppet governments, end quote. And this is contrasted by, quote, Red Empire, formal power. Red Empire are the formal and visible institutions, hierarchies, positions, etc. of power, and is typically martial in nature, end quote. So this is essentially the difference between institutions of soft power and institutions of hard power. Moldbug coined this dualism through interpreting the US as being one country with two governments called red and blue, whereby essentially the red government is the military and the blue government is everything else. The red, along with the blue, have corresponding committee systems and departments. The Blue Empire's headquarters are in Silicon Valley, Cambridge, and Times Square. The Red Empire's headquarters are in Arlington and Pennsylvania Avenue, the Pentagon, etc. And typically those who support the Blue Empire, those with coexist stickers and rainbow flags, are the loudest supporters of democracy while are effectively supporting an entirely unelected blue government. But this is one of the age-old paradoxes of democracy, I suppose. If the best government is a reflection of the will of the people, how can the will of the people then be wrong? This is probably why many Democrats in America don't think there has been a legitimate election of a Republican president since the 80s, and even then George H.W. Bush should still be in prison for the Iran-Contra affair and other things. So on the other hand, we have the red state Republican, who has a similar loyalty and sees the military as equivalent to the nation and sees the Blue Empire as degenerating society and changing things so they weren't like they used to be. We get the picture. So moving forward, we then get to client. The entry for client reads, quote, subject of a patron. Clients are the subjects of a patron, who protects the client in return for their loyalty and labor, end quote. While the entry for patron reads, quote, the liege of a client, the group individuals in the high that a client swears fealty to is called their patron, end quote. So this is fairly self-evident. These are just the terms taken from the formalist idea of successful political movements being occupied by the clients of elites, while on the other hand, elites are the patrons of successful political movements. We can use the example of Chad Warden and Sony.
Sony always wins, baby. Sony always wins. You can't beat Sony.
Well, in my video on liberalism, I went through the funding of various groups like the Civil Rights Movement, Black Lives Matter, and so on, all of which are the clients of elites, while arguing that if the dissident right wants to be successful, it has to have patrons, of which it currently has none. We then get to, quote, delegation. The sovereign delegates autonomy and responsibilities to people. All rights, freedoms, responsibilities are delegated by the sovereign. Generally, the more secure the sovereign is in his rule, the more inclined he'll be to delegate, end quote. So, in an empire, politics is arguing over what autonomy is delegated and to who, not over sovereignty itself. Property, liberty, these things are delegated to people by those who are in power. Hypothetically, everything I own could be confiscated by the state if they saw fit, so in this case, do I really own it? Well, no, my ownership of things is delegated to me and can be taken away in the future. In the same way, I have authority over my things because I have been delegated such autonomy. So all instances of power are the result of delegation by a sovereign. While de Jouvenel was famous in pointing out that despite liberalism being the project intended on escaping state power, under democracy, we see the state grow more than it ever has in mankind's history. This is due to the lack of certainty regarding sovereign power due to the democratic process, promoting endless new power centers and three-letter institutions, designed to resecure other power centers and so on. So when a sovereign is secure in his, or I guess her power, he will delegate more autonomy to those he rules over. We then get to distance to power, which reads, quote, what an individual's/group's relationship to power is. There are three types of relationships to power: high, middle, low, end quote. So before we move on, we will follow this up with the entries for high, middle, and low. Quote, high, the closest to power. The high is the societal elites, the groups and people that have actual power in society and a large amount of influence. The high will generally act as a patron of the middle, but many also in certain circumstances become a patron of the low. Then we get to middle, clients of the high. This group is not able to become a high, but are productive and desirable enough that the high will grant them patronage in return for their loyalty and labor, where they're the power base of the high. Under certain circumstances, the high may abandon them. Then we get to low, the group farthest from power, the group that hold no power or influence in society, and are of low status and desirability in their society, as well as being unproductive and a drain on society. In certain circumstances, they can become clients of the high, end quote. So you will notice these circumstances where the low becomes clients of the high, and this is via the next relevant entry, which reads high, low versus the middle. Quote, the high uses the low to attack the middle if the middle becomes disloyal and threatens the security of the power of the high. The high might use the low to attack the middle until the high's power has been re-secured, end quote. So this schema was given to us by Bertrand de Jouvenel. It is often the constitution by which formalists understand left and right, low, high, and middle just being words to denote classes in society by capital, political rights, property, and so on. The first emergence of the high, low versus the middle strategy being between the middle aristocracy and the high monarchy, and so how things have played out in today's society is that we have the left that is comprised of the low and high, minorities, LGBT, the poor, and corporations, the media, academia, etc., while the right, in contrast, is the middle, the white working class, and the lower, less wealthy bourgeoisie, the politically unconnected business owners, and so on. So this topic has been discussed in my video Bio-Leninism and at length elsewhere, but moving forward. We then get to the entry for Formalism, which reads, quote, the ideology of formalizing power around a sovereign to avoid the high, low versus middle phenomena, as well as reducing imperium imperio. Power needs to become formalized around an actual sovereign who doesn't have to hide, end quote. Now what is imperium in imperio? You probably know that term, translates to state within a state, referring to a power center within a government that is subversive, trying to expand into the territory of other power centers within the same government. A deep state is a typical example of imperium imperio. The entry for it reads, quote, imperium in imperio, hostile, subversive factions within an empire. When an empire becomes so dominant that it has not external enemies, the biggest threat comes from within, where different power centers and factions will try to expand their power at the expense of other power centers and factions, end quote. We then get to power and power center, which reads, quote, power, the ability to influence, manipulate, modulate our societal world. Power is the extent you can influence, manipulate, or modulate people and society. We then get power center, concentrations of power. Power centers are placed within our social order where power concentrates and flows from. Power centers are typically delegations of power from the sovereign. They can come in competition with one another, end quote. So fairly self-evident. And we then get sovereignty. To be the most powerful / influential. In any group, there will always be a person who's the most influential, and within that group, there will be a person who's the most influential, who's the de facto sovereign. Leadership and sovereignty is always demonstrated and thus can't be elected, but there will always be a sovereign whether as a formal position or not, end quote. So we've talked about ontological monarchism. The sovereign is the monarch, existing throughout all democracies, fascist dictatorships, communist regimes, and governments predicated on the will of the people, issuing out permissions and promises of protection to those that guarantee the hierarchy of discipline. Historically, this would have been the lords, the merchants, the soldiers, and so on. Today it is far more social and complex in character and often obscured and difficult to figure out. We then get to the cathedral, one of the most used terms in NRX circles, quote, the progressive liberal elite. The cathedral is a term used to describe the amalgamation of blue empire elites and power centers pushing progressive egalitarianism. Typically includes the mainstream media, academia, NGOs, and interest groups, end quote. Moldbug's emphasis is that it is the ruling elite. It has a leg up on the institutions of the right, or what you could call the conservative or republican elite. And the need for the word cathedral comes from the fact that it is a completely informal institution that isn't an institution as much as it is a superstructure. We then get to woke capital, which reads, quote, "Woke capital, businesses and corporations adopting the cathedral's agenda. Private businesses, corporations, capitalism has in essence joined the Blue Empire elites in pushing their progressive egalitarianism," end quote. So these are intensities along the cathedral's rhizomatic surface, the thistles if you will, the nexus connecting orthodox state progressivism to large capitalist corporations. And after Pride Month just now, we saw all the corporations come out waving LGBTQ colours. And you can go to somewhere like the Twitter account @WokeCapital, which documents hundreds of specific examples of this. But anyway guys, that's gonna have to do it for this video. I just thought we'd go through this glossary of terms that Chonsa made. I thought it was very helpful to just kind of consolidate the vocabulary that we use here on the channel and in the Discord, and you might hear people like Imperius and Joel speak with. But guys, if you liked this video, remember to check out all my social media links, and if you really liked this video, go check out my Patreon or my Subscribe Star or my merch. I just put some new designs up there, so